Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to use this time to welcome all of you to the CPIA Africa 2025 launch. You're most welcome from a very wet Monrovia. This program will be a very interesting but short one, so I encourage all of us to be very attentive as we go through these events. Having said that, I will be your moderator, and I'm Daniel Ankara. At this juncture, I will now call on for welcome remarks the country manager, the World Bank country manager, Georgia Wallen. A round of applause, please.
Good afternoon. Honorable Minister, esteemed government officials, excellencies, heads of organizations, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the launch of the 2025 CPIA in Monrovia, Liberia. We're delighted to welcome you to this event and also to extend a special welcome to Andrew Davalin, the World Bank Chief Economist for Africa, and the CPIA team here for the first time in Liberia. This launch comes at a strategic and important moment for countries across the continent, with 5 years remaining to achieve the 2030 global goals. The 2025 CPIA report's focus on policies for better service delivery gets to the heart of the urgent challenge of stepping up on the achievement of the 2030 goals. It identifies key policy trends in sub-Saharan Africa that make a difference in supporting effective public service delivery. And the focus, or what's reflected in the report, is from 2024. The CPIA is ultimately about informing and spurring policy action. I just want to share a few observations. The first is that the report points to the fact that tangible services impact intangible factors like trust and citizen satisfaction. Public services like access to energy, access to water and sanitation, education, healthcare directly impact how citizens perceive their well-being and quality of life. The CPIA looks at categories such as building human resources, property rights, social protection, and labor. And all of these impact those important intangibles. Second, policies, institutions, and service delivery don't just happen. They depend on the daily work of civil servants, and that work matters. The core of making government function may seem mundane, but this is the key to putting public services, public resources to work for the public good. Finally, we're keen to learn lessons for Liberia. For Liberia, the CPIA launch is especially meaningful against the backdrop of the newly launched Liberia National Development Plan, the Arrest Agenda for Inclusive Development, which aims to spur service delivery, accelerate impact and results on Liberia's Vision 2030. Time is of the essence. I want to encourage you to listen actively and then to download the report, which will be available at the end of today's program, and I think it actually is already available online now. The embargoed report noted on the cover that the embargo ended at 12 o'clock Liberia time. And that last point was especially thrilling for us because this is the first time the report has been launched in Liberia. We believe this is Liberia's Liberia's time. It's Liberia's time to accelerate results, and it's Liberia's moment to shine. So we thank you very much for joining us, and we wish you a very fruitful experience in the event today.
Thank you very kindly, Madam Georgia Wallen. Let me say that Liberia wouldn't mind having the second lunch. Next, I will now call the Acting Minister of Finance and Development, Planning, Minister Anthony Myers, for his opening remarks. A round of applause, please.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Dear Georgia, permit me to say that. Andre, our colleagues from across the different development partner agencies and from government institutions, great panelists. So firstly, you won't see me sitting here, and there's a reason why, but the guy sitting there is more than competent to manage the challenges that will be coming forth. So, following up on what George just said, it's an honor for Liberia to be chosen for what is essentially a regional event. So, on behalf of the minister and the rest of the government, I appreciate this honor given to us as a country and government by the World Bank. So there are a number of observations and conclusions that we can draw from the report. So firstly, it is an opportunity for self-reflection. And we must acknowledge that this process was participatory because the bank and our people across government participated in the research that led to these conclusions that we will be launching today. So while generally one would say, and it's obvious of course, that the school is not what we would expect, they, however, is an opportunity for improvement. That's the first point to note. Knowing our school and knowing where we should be provides an incentive for improvement. That is the headline aspect. However, if you get into some of the details as we see in the summary sheet that is on the flyer, there are also reasons for hope in certain key areas where we score fairly good marks. So in as much as in these areas we are able to score fairly good marks, it's an indication that those areas where the schools aren't favorable, the same amount of effort, the same amount of collaborative work that was put into having better schools in those areas can also be applied in those areas that the schools are so low. So it doesn't create a cause for, let's say, panic, or for the usual or PR or the usual speed that follow events like this or that follow reports like this, because there's the transparency index, there's the PEST index, there's the PIFA index. When this kind of reports come out, there are multiple and varying interpretations in the public. But for us, as far as we are concerned with the engagement that we have with the bank and its institutions, we take this report as a baseline for further improvement on all of our governance issues. And we can assure you, our partners in and outside of government, that to the extent that the Ministry of Finance is involved with coordinating the development processes of the government as well as the management of the economy, because these indicators represent aspect of economic management, they represent aspect of international cooperation, they represent aspect of institutional reforms and governance reforms. We will make all of the efforts. We will use this as a learning experience. We'll use this as a motivation to ensure that the next review, the next report, the 3.1 that we see on the summary sheet, we will be much higher up the scale than what we see here. So with that, and we already have gone a little bit into our time, I want to say on behalf of the Minister of Finance and our colleagues at the Ministry of Finance and Development Planning and across government that this launch event is formally open. Thank you.
Thank you very much, the Acting Minister of Finance, Mr. Anthony Myers. Next is the presentation of the CPIA for Africa report, and this will be done by the Chief Economist of Africa, Mr. Andrew Dabelin, and Nicholas Woolley, the economist. Please give them a round of applause.
Can you hear me? So good afternoon. Minister Myers, government officials, delegations from the development community, distinguished panelists and guests. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Andrew Dabelin. I'm the Chief Economist for the Bank. This is my first time in Liberia, so I'm doubly delighted that we're able to do this. So before I begin, we're going to do this presentation in two parts. I will introduce what we do with the CPIA, and then my colleague, who is actually the primary author of this report in my office, will come and give you the highlights. So I want to say, just as a preamble, three things. One is that, as the Minister and Georgia mentioned, this is a regional launch. So this is not a Liberia-specific launch. This is a report that we produce for the entire region, the Sub-Saharan Africa, which my office is responsible for. And we are the only ones who do this in the World Bank. This report only comes out actually for African countries. The rest of the countries that are considered island-locked. And the reason we do this is because half of the countries that are members of IDA, International Development Association Fund for low-income countries, are in Africa. Okay? So we do this in order to be able to use it as a tool of engagement with our African countries, and also to benchmark the progress as these countries do reforms. Now, those of you who are not familiar with CPIA, the P stands for policies, the I stands for institutions. So it's country policies and institutions assessment. It's an assessment. So, what is it then exactly? What is the CPIA? Where is the... You see? It's not moving. You see? give us a minute to get this settled. Computer seems to be fun management. So while we work on this, so what is the CPIA exactly? So the CPIA is an assessment of policies and institutions of African countries. Now, what we don't do is we don't evaluate outcomes. Okay, we have other tools to do that. What we do is actually instead assess actions and reforms that are in the control of African governments, right? So you do reforms and you take actions in specific areas, whether that is, in education, in health, social protection or not, and then we benchmark those reforms relative to others. So it's a relative assessment. So as you can see, this is a reform. Basically, it's a measure of the quality of reforms, right? So we don't actually do a reform of the assessment. Instead, we basically look at policies that have been undertaken, actions that have been undertaken in specific areas. Now, there are 16 areas where we do these assessments. And we cluster them into 4 big clusters and pillars. One is macroeconomics, the other one is the real sectors, other one is issues around equity, and then the final cluster is public institutions. We do these assessments in a way that is very collaborative and coordinated with the governments, but we have to have an independent assessment ourselves, right? In the end, we discuss these reforms with the government, but we have to have an independent assessment. And these are people who are really knowledgeable about these countries. So these are bank staff that are very knowledgeable about these countries, that live in these countries, that work in these countries, and they are the ones who do these assessments. But there are a whole series of, within the bank, a whole series of checks to see whether in fact these are credible assessments, because there are a lot of people who actually evaluate the evaluators. So what we do is we do both a qualitative assessment but also quantitative assessments. So we take into consideration other people and other institutions' assessments of the government policies and reforms. And then what we do is at the end, we have a benchmark and a league table of, how the governments have performed, right? And in fact, what you see in the report at the end is not just some broad take on the reforms in Africa and the success and failures, but also specific country reforms are the ones that are doing well. And so what I will do is I will end here and invite Nicholas to come and give us some high-level messages, not necessarily specific country messages.
Thank you, Andrew. As Andrew said, the CPIA presents an overall view of the country policy and institutions based off of a review process that incorporates experts and expertise and opinions across the World Bank, incorporating the inputs of over 1,000 people every year. It's my pleasure to announce that for this year, the overall average for sub-Saharan Africa for countries that are eligible for development assistance has been lockstep with the global average. This follows a handful of years, effectively since 2019, in which the region is catching up with the global average. In 2023, the region caught up, and now we can see that this is consistent for the second year running, which is really good news in context, in the perspective of a region with a high level of conflict-affected countries, a high level of resource-rich countries, both of which we know present unique challenges for institutional policy development. Looking a bit more at the detail, as Andrew mentioned, there are 16 different scores for CPIA, and we cluster these according to 4 different clusters. So the first cluster is economics and economic stability. And specifically, that includes macroeconomic management, but also fiscal policy and debt policy. We also have the second cluster, cluster B, which we call structural policies, but those are really focused on private sector development. And so that includes trade, it includes private sector policies, including competition policy, and it includes financial markets as well. The third sector, cluster C, or third cluster, sorry, is all around social equity, gender equality, public protection, poverty policies. And these 3 clusters, economic management, structural policies, and social inclusion and equity, have all done relatively well in recent years. As a matter of fact, they've actually accelerated in recent years. To a point where they're offsetting some poor performance for the region in the 4th cluster. And that's the cluster that focuses mostly on governance. So that includes courts and public sector transparency and accountability, but it also includes kind of more nitty-gritty issues around public financial management, on how money is actually spent in the expenditure side. And so that is actually some of the learning. So what are the trends that are leading to this? Why are these scores actually coming about? And that brings us to the high-level messages in the report. So it's no news to anybody that sub-Saharan Africa has struggled over the last decade with per capita GDP growth. The region has been facing some very strong headwinds, many of which are international. And in many respects, it's there's been some strong efforts to actually respond to these international crises. One thing that's actually worth noting about this is that the countries that the CPIA focuses on, the countries that are eligible for international development assistance, have actually outperformed the regional average for GDP per capita. And specifically, 2024 was a particularly good year in terms of economic growth for these IDA eligible countries. Now, this is all coming in the context of, there have been a lot of measurements of discontent and a lot of expressions of discontent in the region in the last year. And if you ask people what are they upset about, where are the areas where they think that the governments are facing the most important problems, of the top 5 issues that people have identified, 4 of them are public service related. Of the top 10, 5 of them are public service related. So public services are definitely something that people have on their mind when they're expressing their opinions about government. And moreover, when you ask people, they also think that these public service delivery has gotten worse over the last 2 years. So here we see 5 different areas of public service delivery, and people have responded in surveys saying that these public services perform badly at a much higher level than 10 years. So that's cause for concern. Now this all happens in the context of tight credit constraints, in which governments have higher levels of debt than they did 10 years ago, almost across the board. So paying for this public sector and public service delivery is going to be more and more difficult moving forward. And this is the challenge that the region finds itself in. This is probably nothing new to you as I'm talking here today. So the question is, what do we do about that? And this is what the CPIA report really is all about. It's going to require countries in the next few years to both learn from the best practices of how to deliver public services in ways that have worked across the region, but also to be a bit creative and to get attention for that creativity so that other countries can learn from that too. And one of those areas, it's very straightforward, but not very exciting, but very important, is public financial management, right? You're taking a certain amount of money from the population in your taxes, and then those go towards paying for government services. The actual management of the nitty-gritty of how you handle that money can have huge impacts on the quality of services down the line. And this is an area in which there's a lot of opportunity for growth within the region. From things like transparency, reporting, medium-term reports where countries can not just announce their plans for the near-term future, but then can also build credibility by meeting those plans and actually explaining why they do what they do. And another area that is very closely related to public financial management is treasury single accounts, which can have huge impacts on just the basic management of money within government, increasing accountability and transparency for how money is given. So from there, I will encourage you all to go look at the report for specific examples and hand it over to Matt.
Thank you very much, Nikolai, for that presentation. Well, as time is fast spent, we'll now move on to the panel discussion. And I'd like to say that this report places a timely spotlight on a critical pillar of development, which is service delivery. And that is why we have these experts here today who will help us unpack some of these findings, reflect on the progress, and most importantly, chart a way forward. So I'll basically now introduce the panelists and then begin the panel conversation. I have Madam Mary Duncan Merle. She's Mary Duncan Dan. She's the growth coordinator at Plan International, and she has more than 15 years of experience managing strategies, evaluations, and stakeholder engagement for domestic and international health programs. Also on this panel, we have Mr. Gabriel Okiwo. He's the country director of Budge IT Nigeria, a civic organization that leverages technology to improve citizen engagement and drive institutional reforms. Also on this panel today, we have the Assistant Minister for Economic Policy, Macroeconomic and Financial Sector, Minister Henry D.Z. Yankwa from Ministry of Finance and Development Planning. Ladies and gentlemen, please a round of applause for our panelists. And of course, I'm your moderator, Daniel Ankara. So we now begin the panel conversation. Our panelists will have 3 minutes to answer each question, and in order for us to be able to meet up with time. So having said this, let me also say that we are also live on the Ministry of Finance and Development Planning social media page, as well as WebEx from the World Bank. And so we will now get into the conversation. The first question is a shared question for all 3 of you, and like I said, you have 3 minutes to respond. The report suggests that rising discontent reflects poor public service delivery. And if I was add, when I read, I also saw that it's much higher than a decade ago, which might seem concerning. And so first I'd like to gauge your opinion about the interpretation of the report in this specific report. So I'd like to begin with you, Madam.
Thank you so much. Yes, indeed. Rising discontent bring up a lot of issues, especially once citizens are not receiving the required services that are needed to ensure that, yes, indeed, their safety is at rest. So definitely, once those are situations, you see that there are discontentment, you see citizens having this dissatisfaction that gave rise to a lot of protests, like reflecting in the last 2 years, you see that there have been a lot of protests, there have been a lot of coup d'etat in other countries because of the issue with discontentment. So it is very key that government take keen note of citizen services delivery in order to ensure that there is peace and stability in Africa as a whole.
Thank you. Just like you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. So, just all right. Okay. I cannot agree less with the overall outcome of the report. And if I had to, what my sister mentioned, it is also to note that, when you look at the average, one of the interesting things that we saw in that report is that the global average, Africa is catching up or has caught up with the global average 2 years running, which looks good on one hand, but on the other hand, is that for the ordinary citizens, they want to see what does this really translate to in how efficient is the transportation system for me now, how accessible is healthcare services, how affordable is food, energy, and those basic things. For as long as this nice impact achievement we are seeing broadly is not trickling down to improving the everyday life of ordinary citizens, then we are still a bit far from it. So service deliveries, if I then use an example of Nigeria where I came from, right, several reports has pointed to the fact that procurement fraud, right, is the highest chunk of kind of fraud that happens. And where does procurement fraud happens from? It happens from service delivery. That services, that project that's meant to be developed and delivered to local groups, to communities, right? Those are loopholes where this kind of fraud happens. And I'm sure it's not peculiar to Nigeria. So if there is going to be an advocacy action from this report, it is how do we match this improvement we are seeing in macroeconomic output with the lives and the welfare of everyday citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Finally, Minister Yanko, what is your perspective, especially that we're in Liberia? Hopefully we can get a Liberian context to it.
So the issue of rising discontent reflect is rested on post-edit theory. You have no argument to that, you say it's true, but there's a positive correlation between self-delivery and discontent. So I remain true is that it's a factor, but once there is a mismatch of self-delivery, find citizens becoming dissatisfied. The question most citizens know is that there is a social contract between they and the government. So if that piece for the government side is being missing, obviously you have that discontent from the public. Another thing could be your direct impact on daily life. If you're not having electricity, you're not having clean water, you are having building programs, bad roads, you're having ineffective. Sorry. You will actually experience some discontent from the public. You want to look at visible inequality in our corruption. So in the community, those who have are living at a different level, while poor people are living at another level. That margin, that inequality, will actually lead to some level of discrimination. And I'll give you some examples. In Nigeria, we saw protests in this country because of the issue of electricity. In Nairobi, Kenya, we just received what people had issue of the level of tax. Where they were being marginalized and we are holding them somewhere that to think the government will not take well. It's very common in countries like South Africa where you see citizens even going rampage because of job issues. But there are other issues too that have introduced sometimes. The economic hardship, political unrest, you have some social issues, major issues. So what we think we can recommend the way forward as a government is to rationalize public expenditure and put resources to where they are mostly needed. We need to increase investment into our public sector investment program. And I will tell you openly, with the introduction of the AAID, the Arrest Agenda for Incapacitated, we are developing now a working draft of the million-term fiscal framework that will affect the next budget to say we need to put more into public sector investment projects. From 2006 to now, to 2024, we have been able to invest more than 100 billion into direct budgeting for public sector investment projects. I'm using the word direct because we also take loans that go to the projects and we pay back those loans with direct budgeting. The other side, on the real side, we are starting on 2011 where we put in 20% of our resources into PSRP. We haven't been able to spend more than 10% in the policy investment project. So what is the new policy direction for that? We don't want to stop current programs that are ongoing. So we say we hold 2025 as a base year. And any additional revenue, we apply the ratio of 60-40 in favor of capital expenditure.
Okay, so I'd like to hold you there and come to the other panelists. It's interesting, and Madam Dan, some of the recent reports from the African Chief Economist's office have suggested the lack of quality education as a major, service delivery issue. And from your office, Merle, the Merle coordinator at Plan International, how do you see this, and what can be done to address, what effective ways can we address, having quality education?
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you, Daniel, for the question. So, yes, indeed, there have been some improvement in terms of quality education, but the challenge still exists. There are a lot of challenges when it comes to our educational sector. And some of those challenges range from qualified teachers, some range from infrastructures, some range from even the availability of resources to ensure that those services are provided at the standard required. What could be done to improve some of these things? So what we could do as a country, one, could be ensure that our policies that are made are inclusive, make sure that we have both the student, the teachers, including our community at the lower level involved into our policies. Also ensure that we have a fundamental strengthening of the system, that is, ensure that our teachers have those necessary requirements to ensure that they have a stronger foundation, and they also have those requirements that ensure that they are forceful to ensure that education is provided at that standard. Also, we have to ensure that the PTA, that which we call Parent-Teacher Association, is strengthened, because that's another way of ensuring that our children receive the quality education that is needed Because once we have our community dwellers or we have the parents involved in ensuring that there are supervision from the various angles to ensure that those services are given at the quality level, definitely there will be quality educational services received at that lower level. I just want to also say to you that because we have division in terms of educational at the lower extreme versus those at the higher level, we notice that we still have a weak system. So if we can ensure that people at the lowest end are receiving the same standard of education as compared to those in the very biggest cities and so forth, we'll have quality education and we'll have equality when it comes to our services. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Kill, services are often meant to be offered for development and for people to benefit. However, some of these resources are typically centralized in most African countries before they are redistributed. And at the redistribution point, it becomes an issue. What model can we have that will probably work effectively, in the decentralization of resources? What do you think?
Thank you very much. I mean, what we are seeing in a lot of African clients is that local government is being incapacitated, right? And that is a big problem, it's a big gap, because the proximity, those are the proximity of government to the people, the better in terms of efficiency and effectiveness of government delivery process will be, right? A situation where revenue generalization or resource mobilization is concentrated at the center only, right, at the national government only. What we are creating is that we are creating a system that communicates to the other tiers of government that they can go to sleep and just expect answers, right? And most of the time, that creates a sort of dependency syndrome. It creates a lot of gap in inefficiency, right? And that is why in a lot of our countries today, you find things that are simple as empowerment of artisan groups, right? Provision of grinding machine, hairdressing equipment. You find that it is still an intervention that is being done by national government, right? Which is not meant to be. And I believe, right, if we are going to look at sustainable model, the new government we have in Nigeria last year led the Attorney General of the Federation led the court proceeding that led to the judgment of giving autonomy back to the local government. It's there to be fully seen, but that in a place like that is like a step in the right direction. We must give power back to the grassroots, and not just that you give power back to them. Let's create a system that also involves them in revenue mobilization. Let's create a system, I put 3 points down on this. Support local government revenue capacity, right? They should not just be there waiting for answers, whatever that comes. They also need to understand what it is that goes into mobilizing resources. I was discussing with Larry from the airport coming into town. You will see quite a vast expanse of land on both ways, right? And practically, you cannot see any economic activity between there and here, right? And there are people that are living there. If we must improve service delivery, we must create a system where we are able to create local economy, right, that empowers local people, that puts resources in their hand, right, and then they are also able to see themselves in the resources that the national government is generating. Secondly is then for us to put a strong regulatory framework in place, right, and lastly is to enable citizens and pressure groups, right, creating an enabling environment where citizens and pressure groups are able to be involved in monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of the management of these resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, as we are trying to do our best to ensure that services reach people with low income, It's also interesting to ask, how do we draw a line between where people in private positions or people that are considered to be rich the amount of services that reach to them and the provision of services to them may undermine the amount of public service that is provided to people at the lower level. How do we bridge a gap as governments across Africa to be able to even up between service delivery to people who can afford and service delivery to people who cannot afford?
Niger and listening to the compared panelists, like I said before, the issue of inequality is real problem because you can have people live in certain communities from a certain country. I do agree with you equal, but then there are basic needs that will have to be met. We asked a question earlier on the issue of education. We have to provide for people who are in that particular sector. Even though we provide services there. Just this week, yesterday and then there was a bill passed between the country, the Banga Community College to the university there. And we were asking the question, we already have the environment, we already have the facility, we already have the laboratory, we already have the instructor to really teach at the school. This question was being asked all. So when we provide these services, we will see that those who are even at the lower level, be able to answer to that education. Talking about the issue of room. The issue of the private sector, there's no excuse. If we want to improve our economy, our system, we have to invest in it. Yesterday we were called to the House for a hearing. I want to comment on Doku, on Bukore and others, on the issue of export closely evacuation. There are a lot of resources escaping our shores from our very resources that investors come to our country, mine our gold, our diamond, our iron ore, sell them out there, and they're not even bringing it back into our country. They wouldn't bring back what we used to pay, the little taxes we get, maybe royalty or the pay tax. Those resources should be resident in our bank. They're not restricting them on how to use them. They have to come back to our shores. If we have our banks very liquid, to be able to lend out to SMEs. When SMEs income is increasing, they move to the million level, they provide more jobs. Household return the benefit, they get more resources, they can now provide new product aids, they can provide legislative, the children will be able to have more time to do reading. And all these issues have impact on the health sector. Just this week on the news, we hear that some of our rural health facilities in selected counties are being solarized. That means we have to go longer out around the services. If you try to solarize even educational institutions, our community colleges, you have students having more time in the school, more time in library. So that's where you find people who cannot send a child out of school to go to school, or people that cannot afford to go to other places to seek medical services. They still have those services that really get in the country, and those are brought in extensively from the resources of the country. They can trust the government in that.
It's a fine line. So finally, final questions across to the panelists as we will shortly wrap up this conversation. Now come to people at this point. How can we show that budget reform and best practices in the public financial management sector can generate positive change at the delivery level?
Yes, we need to begin to look at some global best practices, particularly when it comes to service delivery, right? The idea of service delivery is not just to apportion resources for what we think the people need, right? We need to begin to really shape our approach to what we call the bottom-top approach, starting from the needs assessment of the people, right? And it's not enough to have needs assessment, but also to ensure that there is a system that creates a full picture of what needs to be addressed, what may be affected in the process of us addressing this need, what are the likely problems that we are also likely to create or might emerge as a result of creating or addressing a current needs at hand. so that when we have all of this full picture, number one, it allows us to strategically contribute to development. We have had instances that were part of Nigeria we have gone to where a new government at the subnational level came into power, and without an assessment of the state of education infrastructure that the state has, the government wanting to, impress or do well, declare free education for the states, and all of a sudden you will then find a new problem in your hand. Free education in the state, you now have a facility that's meant to cater for 100 persons, you have 1,000 persons in your hand, 1,000 pupils in your hand, right? And that was because there was no proper assessment that was done. Yes, we will identify the need, government should identify the needs, address the need, but in addressing the need, we need to put in strategy into it. We need to put systems in place. In some other place, I think it is in the UK, it's in the UK that they have the green treasury book, something like that, where there is certain form of evaluation. In some other times you do environmental impact evaluation for you to know this need we want to address, what other thing does it will it create, right? Service delivery at the grassroots level is critical. That is the best way that we can show development. That is the best way, right? Development sector, anything we do, we must be able to see the impact of that on the life of human life at the end of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriel. Finally, Madam, what strategies can civil society organizations like yours do to help push for an effective form of reform and be able to hold governments accountable?
So, if CSOs should be able to hold government accountable, meaning that those CSOs should serve as ambassadors to be able to hold government accountable. First thing, there should be inclusiveness in decision making. All decisions that are going to be made should include all of those responsible to ensure that those decisions are decisions that are holistic. Also, civil society should also ensure that whatever decisions that are made have realistic targets, and also there are room for review. And in reviewing those strategies or those plans that are made, they should be able to have room for tracking, and also ensure that whatever that comes out, the challenges, they are able to identify or discuss way of handling those challenges, and they are able to have room for reframing some of those decisions that are made. So for me, I would tell you that in order to have civil society holding government responsible, there should be room for inclusiveness in whatever decisions that will be made. We should also have room for review of those decisions. We should also have room where we'll be able to ensure that monitoring, evaluation, supervisions are all done to see what level we are to in continual check and balance to ensure that we have quality services at the lower end. Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, sometimes it's not that a government may not want to provide service. Sometimes it's because of the internal politics associated with the provision of different kinds of services. And at this point, how do you think civil society organizations, who may not be your friends but not your enemies as well, how do you think they can help you, government, as a government, in navigating some of the internal politics, that may exist in most governments and may impact, adequate service delivery?
Now, in the first place, we need government and not the people who have ideas. So we need to open up to our people. That's the reason why engaging CSO start on the planning side first. We must have a national plan. In carving a national plan, you must involve all stakeholders, including CSO. In the case of the foreign government, we're developing the AID. We needed to do a national plan. Also, they counted them national. The very last plan, we went to districts, talk to CSOs, talk to the local heroes, to have that input. We have measurable indicators in there that also came from that. That serves as a point of evaluation for the government. Now, the next thing we have to do is to report on AID regularly. During the week after 5 years, we have a report. Today we have a group of our technicians in BD and working on some of the documents. If you come up with a report every year or by some measurable period, CSO and other stakeholders will tell you, you say you do X, Y, Z. You know, the last time I went for a hearing, I was CSO there. We write our questions and our comments on paper and give it to me to be able to have that view. So I think that there's no way we can move the country forward without having a kind whether they are your friend or not, that issue. We will have the country to govern and govern by nearby.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. May we give our panelists a round of applause. We will take just 2 questions. If anyone has a question for any one of our panelists, we will just, because of time, we will just take like 2 questions. If anyone has a question for our panelists. Yes, I think
The mic is
okay, if you're there, you just go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm Samuel S. Dean Sr., and I'm the Executive Director of the National Commission on Disabilities. I would like to thank the World Bank for such a monumental program, and the panelists are doing well also. Mine is more like a statement and not a question, because I hear a lot about inclusivity, and I don't hear a lot about, you know, building roads with world-class design, you know, accessibility. Even this building is not accessible. There's not even a sign language interpreter to be able to interpret to people who are deaf to understand what's going on. They make parts and parcel of the country. I remember a few months back, I attended the Ahmad Berlin Conference, the Disability Summit, Global Disability Summit, and it spoke to 15% of international development funding being purposefully given for persons with disability in the developmental agenda. Because as we know, persons with disability are mostly overlooked, underestimated, discriminated against, stigmatized. In fact, in Liberia, ours is a social sanction stigma, whether inadvertently or deliberately, that remains to be seen. So my thing is, and my question and recommendation is, when World Bank or any development partner is giving out money for development, I think that they should subscribe to the Ahmad Berlin Conference, which has a 15% for 15%, meaning 15% of the world population are persons with disabilities, and so that means 15% of developmental fiduciary responsibility should come to persons with disabilities. And I'm not talking about money to get blind people off the street, which is very important. Blind beggars need to get off the street. But we're talking about investing into disability issues, like, say, for example, assistive technology device. Persons with disabilities can tap into the $38 billion assistive technology device market and can be major former sectors contributors to Liberia. But it's an ordeal that, you know, we get the wrong end of the stick. And because there's nothing that specified that 15% of this money that comes to the country should go to persons with disabilities, we continue to see exclusive street begging. We continue to see aggressive panhandling. We continue to see inequality. Somebody talk about inequality. We continue to see the lack of inclusivity. And in the agenda for our arrest agenda for inclusive development, specifically speak to inclusivity. Our president ruled in the election in Montreal of diversity. But unfortunately, we were not talking about that. And when we talk about that, we usually refer to women. But persons with disability encompass 20% of the population. And I think it's a population that needs attention. And there can be no development without disability equity. So I think international partners and like the World Bank should also invest in disability equity by, subscribing to the Armored Berlin Conference or the 15% for 50%. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question? Sorry. I mean, that's the only hand I saw. George, can you help me? Was there another hand back there? So look at us. Okay, so if those are all the questions, then we say thank you to all of our panelists for the interesting conversation. I'm sure all of us have been taking notes and taking key points where necessary. At this juncture, I will call now I'll call back the Chief Economist from the World Bank to provide us with the closing remarks for this program. Let's give him a round of applause, please.
Okay, so thank you so much to the panelists. I was obviously, listening very attentively. So thank you, Gabriel, Mary, and Mr. Henry. That was something we need to think about ourselves. If I may summarize, what I learned was that, there is a real reason for the discontent taking place in the continent, right? They're going through economic hardship. Service delivery quality is not up to par. And we should mention that, in fact, this is not a problem that's going to go away easily, given the demographic trends in the continent, right? This is a continent where population will double in our lifetime, the next 25 years. And all these people, the ones who are alive now, thank goodness, and the ones who will be born need services in order to flourish. And so it's going to get tough for African countries. And so there is an urgency of governments to become more efficient. That's what I've heard from you. To become more inclusive, as that gentleman just mentioned. It shouldn't be that complicated to build a little ramp in a building like this, for people who are disabled to be able to who need that ramp to be able to have access to this building to have so. They not only inclusive, but the quality of the services need to improve, and then these services need to be felt in the lived lives of people. That's the message I think that has come very, very clear. And then finally, you mentioned, not finally, second last point that I heard from you as panelists is that we need to have state capabilities improve, for example, strengthen, for example, the capacity of local governments to deliver services, have that local government be working in partnership with central governments, but also in partnership with private sector, which we will need badly going forward for obvious reasons that I'm about to mention. You need to have a private sector that is going to be, we need to deliver services that are going to make private sector competitive, but also attractive to a particular locality and context. So that's what I've had, and that's all extremely on point and encouraging. But let me just give you a couple of other points in closing. The continent faces a very difficult context. First, we have a geopolitical competition we haven't seen in several decades. And we don't know which direction it will take. And it will obviously affect a lot of the things that we talked about. How our states react, how they organize themselves, and so on and so forth. We have disruption in trade, which obviously will affect global, economy. It will affect trade arrangements and so on and so on. Potentially lead to fragmentation. Hopefully not, but we never know. So that's another thing that that the continent is facing. The aid architecture is changing. A lot of countries are basically cutting aid or walking away from it, and that also will have potentially disruption. Even if it is in the short term to medium term, it will be very disruptive. But in the meantime, there are a lot of our countries also are dealing with debt, very high levels of debt, where many of them are actually spending more money servicing debt than they are spending on education and health services that desperately need to be delivered, right? So this is where these countries are. These are the challenges. What this means is that a lot of the things that so far have been anchors of this long century of globalization are coming under pressure and challenged. So what that implies is that in fact, if you can't rely on them anymore, as in the past, the one thing that that is under the control of African governments is reforms, internal reforms, that strengthens their economies, that it strengthens, their capabilities. So the reason why we do something like the CPIA is precisely because those kinds of reforms can be a real tool for building a momentum of internal reforms. Now, the World Bank uses the CPIA reforms as part of its IDA allocations, the International Development Association Fund allocation, right? And a lot of countries sometimes get motivated because they get additional, resources in order to be able to. So they do these reforms potentially. But internally in the bank, when we talk to African governments, we tell them that's nice and good, but that is not the main purpose why you should do this reform. The main reason why you should do this reform is because precisely what we've just heard. A, the gains to doing reforms are much larger than what you can get from IDA allocations. Much, much larger. Why? The investors will look at your country that is really a major reformer, and they say, I want to go and invest there. Okay? And you're likely to attract billions and billions of dollars in private sector investments, whether that is in mining, whether that is in public-private partnerships, in energy generation, whether that is in trade, and so on and so on, right? So the gains to actually doing these internal reforms that serve as a signal are much, much larger. And that's what's going to create jobs, that's what's going to increase incomes, and that's what is what will enable you to build better services and increase public trust and cooperation from citizens, right? So that is the reason why we use the CPIA, not for either, to impress either, allocations, but to really, really do reforms that are going to be extremely important for the country and for the citizens of that country. And for citizen-government relationships too. So I want to end there. Thank you so much for all of you for your time and for coming to this session. And we look forward to further engagement around this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now take 2 questions from the media. 3 questions from the media. So please call your full name, the institution you work for, and then your question. Yes, we can go ahead.